All right. Stuff that, oh, football pads. Yeah, I bet that did stink. Yeah. I bet that did. Okay. Now we have a little evidence of our pre-class chat. It's cold. Did you guys notice? I have one of those nice two-story houses where one story, oh, cheerleader brace. I hadn't thought about that either. Um, Upstairs is warm, downstairs is cold. I may have to move class upstairs for the next class. All right. World War II, I think that's what we're talking about. And oh my goodness, did you notice the election is 1 week away? I don't know if I've ever been more thankful to see the end of a presidential election in my life. Plus, we have the exciting school board elections here in Leander, so all kinds of great stuff going on. And it'll all be over in a week. The counting won't, but a lot of the other stuff will be. Stuff you need to know for class. I did post, I'm going to close the chat where we're talking about what sporting equipment smells the worst. What did I put in there? Oh, review stuff for the quiz. I finally finished the quiz. That took forever. I don't know what was up with that. So let me share that with you. I believe I put it in the course documents section. I should probably go back and check. And I think I sent you an email that said that, but I might not have. Also, there's like 2 or 3 really insistent people. There's one in this class. I think I have one in each class. So they really just want to take the quiz more than once. And my intention was always that you just take the quiz once. So, and the people who are being insistent is like, well, but you let us have multiple attempts. That's really just in case the technology fails. Because college class, I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to make it too hard, but I also don't want to make it too easy. Plus, once you've seen the quiz questions, you probably are going to know the answers. So next session is due middle of, let me look on my phone, the calendar part of my phone. I don't have that on my phone. I should, shouldn't I? 13th. Oh, Friday the 13th. Did I do that? I did. Yep, Friday the 13th. And I think I made the extra credit e-thing due the week before. So extra credit e-thing on the 6th, which hopefully you got to see. I can show you that too. And the normal stuff on the 13th. And hopefully I will be done grading all the stuff in the near future this week. I really need to because, yeah, my other job kicks in this week, which is also grading. And if I don't, I can't have both of you guys at the same time. I just can't. So sharing, that's what I want to do. All right. So this is let me close the chat. It keeps opening. Review items. I think this is what I posted. I was hoping I posted this instead of the actual quiz. I've posted the actual quiz before once, and I don't think anybody noticed it. I hope not. It wasn't this class. It was over the summer. I'd forgotten, I did these additional resource things for my summer classes. And like, I know you guys love history, so I know you want to look at extra stuff. So these things are not necessarily like things you have to look at, but just if you might be interested. So, and most of them I think are video sources. I think some of them might be, list of stuff. Part of the reason that I did that is if you wanted extra information, you thought maybe it would help you on a study or a quiz, one of the weekly questions. And I haven't posted the Turnitin place for the weekly questions for all of them. I just did the first one because a couple of you said, like, I want to turn in my question now. I'll go back and add those before Wednesday. So sorry. But if you want more information about stuff, there's lots of things here that you could look at for each chapter. I also get that you're probably really busy and may not have time to look at the stuff, but you can look at it later, maybe. And let's see, what else did I want to show you? Oh, the extra credit thing. Okay. Show you the extra credit thing, although you probably already saw it. You know, it hasn't been 100 years since I've used Zoom. Poop. Okay, there we go. I almost swore. That's as close as I ever get. All right, so this is the extra credit thing. And it's really not, I'll probably put the points on exam. No, I think I added it to where it just goes into the grade book. So this assignment, sorry. Excuse me, this assignment truly is extra credit. You don't have to do it, but it's pretty simple stuff. Maybe you watch this video about Japanese internment. You could do other stuff too, but that's what I would do because it'd be easiest. And while you're watching it, ask yourself, is there anything in here that looks like maybe it's not true? So your general discussion about propaganda would be what in the source of propaganda, whether you use the, excuse me, let me grab the other two people coming in, whether you use the online, the written sources, the posters, that sort of thing, or you use the video. Look at stuff in there that seems true, look at stuff in there that seems like it's probably exaggerated, and then talk about what's true, what's not true, because propaganda that works pretty well has to have some element of truth in it, but they either leave out stuff that makes the source look negative or untrue, or it's just extremely exaggerated. So on the video, they talk about how everybody's really not unhappy to go in the internment camps. There's not a lot of resistance, which honestly, that part was true. That they were helpful, that there was some minor sacrifice involved. You know, most people lost about 80% of their net worth in this process. So it's way more than minor sacrifice. Plus all of your individual rights, which is kind of a problem. And make sure if you do this, that you do this bottom part. I was trying to highlight it. It's not working that well. Source of the propaganda, intended audience, part of the items that seems exaggerated or dishonest, and whether you think propaganda was effective. So, excuse me, and you can look at other sources too if you want, but if you want to do that, great. If you don't, it doesn't hurt my feelings at all. So just, you know, extra points there if you want them. 10, so it's like a weekly question, so it's kind of cool. It's not, and hopefully not terribly hard. But I also get, you know, you're busy. So if you have time, that's great. If not, don't worry about it. All right, we should probably talk about the stuff for today. And I think it's not World War II today, is it? We finished I think we kind of finished World War II. So we're into the 50s chapter. Yeah, the US and the Cold War. You really kind of have two chapters about the 50s. And this first one really talks a little more about foreign policy and the Cold War. And this is the thing, man, if you were old like me, you wouldn't even need this chapter. You just trust me on this. We knew all about the evil, godless communists, and we were scared of them all the time and knew that our entire planet was going to be nuked because of those evil, godless communists in the Soviet Union. And then there's sort of a period of revision in US history where people talked about how we really just made that up and the Soviet Union was not really any threat at all. And now we're kind of somewhere in the middle, which I think is probably a little more accurate, where the Soviet Union, you know, they're bad. I mean, not the whole country. It's a totalitarian system and Stalin is the leader. So that school of thought that the Soviet Union was really kind of harmless sort of overlooks the Stalin thing. And I know one of you talked last time about how Khrushchev wasn't as bad as Stalin, and you're right about that. As the leader, he wasn't. As the head of purges for Stalin, he was, yeah, that wasn't good. But he did sort of modernize some stuff a little bit, but he probably entered a little more directly into, I don't know if it's necessarily an economic competition with the United States, but more of the production side, you know, making weapons, but also making consumer goods. And some people would argue that that really stretched the Soviet Union beyond its limits and led to the economic collapse. But I don't know that you want to blame that on Khrushchev. You can if you want. Um, I won't ask you to. So, all right. But we should talk about the Cold War. And we go a little nutty during this time period, in my opinion. It was a little judgmental, wasn't it? And we think that anybody who speaks badly about the United States probably wants to bring it down. So this is going to be a little bit of a hard time for people who want reform in the United States. The 1950s is not, it's interesting because culturally, in many ways, it's not a good time for reform, but since it's actually time for reform, we seem to do it anyway, and maybe in spite of ourselves as a country, but it's not an accident. I would never suggest that. There have been people, you know, we started to talk about the NAACP working on overturning segregation in schools. That started in the 1920s. You just see the culmination of that in the 50s. But you couple that with all the anti-communist stuff going on during this time period, and it's an unusual time period. Plus, it's as wealthy probably overall as we've ever been in U.S. history. I don't mean, I mean, I know we live large now. I got it. We all have cell phones and lots of stuff we don't need, that kind of thing. This is kind of the era where that started, only people seem to have more, I guess, more money compared to debt. You know, their assets versus debt ratio was better then. And also the improvement in the economy went beyond just the upper class. You know, it really seemed to spread pretty evenly through the middle class and the lower class. And the middle class grows dramatically during this time period. So by around 1960, I think it's our lowest poverty rates in modern history. So, all right. All right, we'll start talking about stuff. Now, this chapter is a little more, again, I already mentioned this. This is a little bit more about the foreign policy, and the foreign policy is really, really focused on evil, godless communism. Just keep that in mind. It's never just communism. It's always evil and godless. Just trust me, trust me. I wasn't born then, but I got the effects of it because my parents were teens in the 50s. My husband's parents were, well, they're a little older, so they were 20s, in their 20s in the 50s. And because they were a little less white and not in the Midwest, had a very different experience in the 50s. I always enjoyed listening to my parents talk about how great the 50s were. And my father-in-law, it's like, we sued this person and we sued that person and we desegregated this school. It's like, I got it. It was different for you, truly. But very interesting stories from both sides. So, also, I know that my parents also were not telling the truth, which is an interesting factor of the 1950s, where if something was bad, you didn't talk about it. And that was kind of a generational thing. And even though my father-in-law would talk a lot about how bad segregation issues for Mexican Americans in West Texas were, and he wasn't kidding, he was right about that, stuff that was personal and bad, you know, things that were difficult in their family life or discrimination that they personally experienced outside of jobs, they really didn't talk about that. So they would talk about political stuff that was bad, but not personal stuff that was bad. And it's also why people who were civil rights leaders during this time period were sometimes seen as pro-communist, because they were advertising out loud in a public way that the United States was not perfect, the way that we assumed it must be because the evil, godless communists of the Soviet Union were so bad. All right, I know, I still haven't started. I'm going to though. I have started, it was just an overview. So here we go. All right, so World War II ends. We've decided we're going to split Germany into 4 different sectors. They're also going to split up Japan. And there's 4 allies. So you have England, UK, France, United States, Soviet Union, USSR. And what happens in England, or excuse me, in Germany, is that the three more Western allies merged their sectors that they controlled into what becomes West Germany, which was the thing when I was a kid. And then the Soviet sector becomes East Germany. And then as the Soviet Union is freeing countries from Nazi control, they're also setting up governments that are related to the Soviet Union. They'll refer to them later on as satellite nations, because our assumption is, and we're mostly correct, that the Soviet Union is controlling both the economy and the government of those countries. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, weren't we controlling other countries? Well, of course we were, but we did it in a kinder, gentler way, a more democratic way. So we didn't necessarily send our military in, except in Japan, and just take the thing over and go like, this is ours, you'll do what we say. We mostly controlled them with the economy. So, but you know, they had a choice, sort of, kind of, mostly. But if they made the wrong choice, occasionally we'd send in the CIA to overthrow their government. But you know, sometimes these things just had to be done. The one that they talk about in this chapter the most, I think, is Iran, where we overthrew their government because they were going to give access to oil fields to, you know who, the evil, godless communists of the Soviet Union. So, and we still worry a little bit about Russia. I know they're not exactly the same as the Soviet Union and their alliance with Iran. We do still worry about that, don't we? All right. So, growing fears of communism within the United States as the two superpower world emerges. So it's an us versus them idea. And there's going to be a whole lot of writing about this. Some of the more obvious things are George Kennan's long telegram, where he suggests the containment policy, not that we can stop communism, but we need to stop the spread of it, which is containment. And we'll talk about all those definitions in a minute. And there's also the suggestion that this really is an us versus them sort of situation. So the goal of either country is to dominate the world, and the Soviet Union is our mortal enemy, that they want to destroy us in that process. Now, we would never want to destroy them unless they wanted to destroy us first. And then we would happily retaliate with great force, but we're not going to start stuff, is kind of our position. But we are more than ready to respond as needed. Okay, so Eastern communist regimes take over in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, lots of other countries, of intervention in Iran, which is when the United States goes in and helps them pick a new leader, the Shah of Iran. That'll turn out poorly later on for us. Winston Churchill will give a speech where he talks about an iron curtain emerging in Eastern Europe, and that all the lights are going out behind that curtain. And that was metaphorical, that, you know, there was no freedom, no opportunity to choose in elections. And part of the reason that we said that is, well, is partly true. They had a one-party state, a single-party state, which you might think of as a dictatorship. It is possible that they would have contested elections, but it's pretty unlikely. And there's very little contested anything in the Soviet Union in the Stalin era, for sure, because if you contested too much, you either went to jail or magically disappeared. So it's probably a little less, I don't want to say it's less of a dictatorship when Khrushchev is there. It's a kinder, gentler dictatorship, perhaps, where you probably just went to jail instead of getting killed. And then as in the 70s, it becomes different, honestly, as the power of the Soviet Union begins to decline. But even though their power, especially their economic power, declines over time, they've still built all those nuclear weapons. So they're still, you know, they're still dangerous. And the breakup of the Soviet, yeah, we'll talk about that. Sorry. Okay. So, containment policy, Iron Curtain speech, long-term struggle developing between Eastern communism and Western capitalism in Europe. So this really sets the stage for all of the events that seem to occur politically, diplomatically in the 50s. Okay, here's some really important definitions for you. Containment is just the idea. This is going to be the guiding principle of our foreign policy for a very long time. Honestly, probably up until I finished college round one, so in the 80s. So containment is limiting, controlling, or containing the spread of communism throughout the world. And if you're wondering why, you know the answer, because it's evil and godless. Haven't we talked about this already? Because it limits freedom. And the United States is the beacon of freedom. We're bringing back the shining city on a hill idea. And Ronald Reagan will even use that in speeches. I remember it quite well. All right, so containment, limiting, controlling, or containing the spread of communism throughout the world. And this foreign policy develops right after World War II. You'll hear, well, you won't personally hear this because, you know, you're not old, but you can find videos of Truman talking about this. And, you know, it's part of George Kennan's long telegram, but it's part of pretty much every bit of foreign policy that develops in the 50s and extends through the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. The Iron Curtain is the partitioning of Western Europe, democratic and free, from communist-controlled Eastern Europe. An excerpt from, or a phrase from Winston Churchill's speech at the Missouri Military Academy. I think it's Missouri Military Academy in Fulton, Missouri. It's not a physical wall or fence or curtain or anything like that. All right. Truman Doctrine. And President Truman will say this in a speech after the British, who had been helping the Greeks and the Turks fight communist revolutions, internal communist revolutions within their countries. England's just broke. So they said, hey, United States, we're broke, you know, World War II and stuff. So we know you guys have cash. Can you help Greece and Turkey fight off the communists? And we had already talked about containments, like, oh, heck yeah, we got to contain communism. So Truman will give a speech where he says that the United States is willing to spend essentially whatever it takes to stop the spread of communism in Greece and Turkey, and also pledges to do a similar thing in any country that is resisting outside pressure or revolution within their own country. So the Truman Doctrine is the US pledge to defend any government resisting communism with either financial or military assistance, and we really are talking military assistance here, as an initial response to these internal communist revolutions in Greece and Turkey. So Truman asked Congress for $400 million, but suggests that we could spend up to half of our budget on defense and containment policies, which we never did. We never even spent half of our budget during World War II on military stuff. I don't think we've ever spent half, you know, it's interesting. I don't know if you guys, maybe it's not interesting to you, sorry. I don't know if you guys ever look at budget numbers, but what the US spends most of their money on. And I think my favorite thing when I hear people talk about budget numbers is like, we need to really cut off these foreign countries that talk bad about us because we're giving them so much money, and then they're, you know, they're talking bad about us. Our foreign policy, like direct aid budget, is something like 1% to 2% of our budget. Now that doesn't mean it's not a lot of money, but it's not the bulk of the money. Most of our money, of course, goes to support people within the United States. I think fully half of it right now is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Usually we're somewhere between 15 and 25% on military stuff, and then 25% on whatever else. There's a lot of whatever else's. So, but Truman said we could spend half of our, I think he even said half of our GDP, which is way more than our budget, on military, on containment, which we never even got close. But okay, but we do, you know, we spend a pretty large percentage, in the larger percentage than we had before, after, on military stuff during the Korean conflict, and that era of the Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict. All right, Marshall Plan. This is, George Marshall says this. He is the Secretary of State, but had been one of the major generals in World War II. And this is articulated, that's a nice word, said, during, during a commencement speech at Harvard. This is why when you graduate from college, whether it's round one at ACC or round two at whatever fabulous university you transfer to, perhaps Angelo State, you have to pay attention to the speech, because maybe somebody's going to issue a foreign policy dictates in your graduation speech. But the Marshall Plan comes from graduation address at Harvard, and he says that we are willing to spend an enormous amount of money on the rebuilding of Western Europe. Now, are we doing this because we're kinder and gentler? Heck yeah. Also, are we doing it because we don't want any more of Europe to go evil, godless, and communist? There's that as well. So we make a very large financial pledge to rebuild any nation in Europe that, one, requests our assistance, and two, includes a governing plan that includes a multi-party state. So what we're saying is, you can't be communist. I'm not saying you can have a communist party, because lots of countries did have communist parties during this time period, but those tended to be very small minority parties. And if you've lived other places or just paid attention to other places' government, most countries do have multi-party states where 2 or 3 parties have to collaborate and form coalition governments, that sort of thing. So we wanted them to have at least 2 parties. So, if you want money from us, that's the way it has to go. So all of the Western European nations submitted plans, and our goal here is to ensure political and economic stability and protect against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, or chaos, as it's often said. So we don't want everything to fall apart and then all of these countries to go like, Soviet Union, please save us, we need your help. So we want to create an economic system and a political system where institutions of freedom can exist. So this could be anything from independent schools, independent press, of course, capitalism. Yeah, so we want, not necessarily a government-directed economy, although we do understand that there are going to be democratic socialist countries that emerge from this. The Marshall Plan, honestly, pretty successful thing. And you will see Western Europe rebuild and really thrive economically for a period of time. So you'll see a general economic revival in Western Europe, which solidifies the divide between the East and the West, in part because the West has more money. So you'll start to see, you'll start to see some people from eastern parts of Europe trying to emigrate into western parts of Europe, which will eventually lead to building of walls and things like that, and some crackdown from certain governments. So, and if you're wondering, like, am I talking Berlin Wall? Yeah, I was hinting at that, but that happens at the end of this decade. So it's coming. And it's really easy to kind of conflate the Berlin Wall with the Berlin blockade and airlift. They don't happen at the same time, which, everyone always thinks they do, but they don't. You're going like, I never even thought about it because I have an actual life. Don't talk about studying history like it's not an actual life. What are you people thinking? All right. You're wondering what's going on in Japan? Honestly, whatever we say is going on in Japan. That sounds really bad, but there'll be things that sound worse that people say. Thank you for saying history is awesome. Okay. All right. Yeah, and believe me, I get it. And I appreciate when you guys type in the chat, like, if I gotta go, this is the reason, or my kid's puking, or that kind of stuff. Man, the world's different this year, isn't it? So I know if you're, a lot of us are at home right now, and if stuff happens, stuff happens. I'm always hoping like no one comes to the door, or, that hairless cat doesn't jump on my porch again or something. Hairless cat. That thing scared the life out of me one day. All right, hairless cat. Looks like a giant rat. Who has those things? You know who had those things? Probably people in, no, people in Japan didn't have those things, but, well, maybe they did, but I have to get back to this. So, um, in Japan, they really are just kind of doing what we tell them to do. And the book's pretty accurate about this. And this may sound harsh to you, because it is. I suppose it is. Um, one of the weird conversations that you will see between Americans and people from Japan that you see in kind of contemporary writing of this era is how they think Japan would have behaved if the tables were turned. So most of the people in Japan at that time looked at the United States as being a fairly benevolent conqueror, because their thought was, we would have done so much worse to you. So I don't know if that's something you want to accept or not. You could read more, and maybe you would come to the same conclusion as I would, or as I did. But again, you don't have to. But the U.S. is rebuilding Japan, and some of you are going like, well, wasn't that nice? And some of you are like, didn't we nuke it? Yes and yes. So there are reasons we're rebuilding Japan, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also all of the traditional what it can't think of the right word, but the I don't want to say normal bombing, but just the not nuclear assault was really pretty rough as well in Japan, building up to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Japan had really taken a lot of hits, quite literally. So rebuilding Japan seemed to be our thing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We are going to help design things for Japan so that they can be, better, much more like us. So we're going to essentially write their constitution for them and say, like, hey, here you go. You're going to have multi-party state. The women are going to vote. You can have enough military to defend yourself from not very many people. So a very small defensive military, maybe just to make sure people don't break in or something. But we did want Japan to be economically successful, because it's going to be kind of our base of operations in the Pacific. We also kind of saw the direction China was headed, even though they had traditionally been our allies. And of course, the Soviet Union is right nearby. So we need to have a point of influence in the Pacific, and we are just certain that Japan's going to be it. I think one of the most uncomfortable quotes that I can remember reading was from MacArthur, who refers to the Pacific as an Anglo-Saxon lake during this time period, because we've taken over so much of it and rebuilt so much of it in our own image. So saying that this is kind of our launching point for nation building is a very fair assessment. Now, Japan is going to become pretty Western looking. I mean, if you see pictures during that time period, it's going to have those bright neon lights, and it's going to look like the most modern Western European US cities that there are. And certainly English is going to become an important language for trade in that region. And Japan, to this point, still doesn't have a large military. We're still their military. It's kind of a deal. And this is the era where we really start becoming the military for a lot of people, and NATO is created. And then, of course, the current president, Trump, has pushed back quite a bit on that, which some people think is brilliant and some people think is really weird. And some of you are going like, man, I don't even know about this stuff. So, all right, looking back at your comments here. They did just actually amend their, oh, okay. Okay. No, thanks for keeping up with the Japanese Constitution for me. Yeah. No, that's good. I know you didn't do that for me, but I appreciate it. So, yeah, there's certainly issues in that part of the world between Japan, China, Taiwan, other nations as well. North Korea is kind of an exciting place, isn't it? So, yes, and you will see Japan deploy troops in support of NATO operations even in earlier days. But part of what I don't know why I want to talk about Trump's foreign policy, but part of what Trump's foreign policy change is to make NATO really less funded by the United States and more participatory within the other member nations, which I think there's no way we would have been okay with this during this era that we're talking about, because we saw the world as, I don't want to say bipolar in the mental health sort of situation, but there's two superpowers, the United States, the Soviet Union. And if we weren't controlling something, we knew the Soviet Union would get control of it. So we really wanted to control NATO for a variety of reasons. In the modern era, I don't know if people still see the world in the idea or in the way that there are two superpowers. If you do, I'm guessing you don't think Russia's one of them, but maybe you do. I don't know. I know that they mess with, elections and stuff, but you'll notice maybe a little bit in this chapter that we mess with each other pretty consistently, and we tend to do it during election years. That's not a new thing at all. But yeah, Soviet Union, which it doesn't turn into Russia, but when it breaks up the bigger part of its Russia, they're still up to stuff. Yeah. Yeah, definitely the idea that it's the United States versus Russia in the modern era doesn't make a lot of sense. I think maybe for electronic warfare in some ways, but I'm sure China would like to assert that they're part of that, as would North Korea. So there's a whole lot of things going on. There may be, 2 or 3 different teams in the modern era, maybe, but they're not official alliances. And I don't know, at least, in my generation, foreign policy was easier to understand, us versus them. Yeah. And China, oh my goodness, yeah, we'll talk more about China later. During this era, China is starting to have their civil war, and by the end of the 40s, Mao Zedong will have prevailed, and China, the government of China, will become communist. Our assumption will be that this was in league with the Soviet Union. What we'll find out, as we pay a little more attention moving forward, is that China and the Soviet Union are not really buddies. They're competing for certain things as well. So, all right, back to this. Although foreign policy, so confusing. Again, so much easier back then. Beautiful, perfect United States of America, evil, godless communists of Soviet Union. So much. All right, and everything we did was great. But honestly, a lot of the stuff we did was I don't know, some of it was good. The outcomes were, oh dear, I'm not even going to say anything else. Who knows? Who knows? You guys get to decide if it's good or bad. All right, so we're going to rebuild Japan and restructure their constitution, and it will lead to an era of great prosperity in Japan that I'm not suggesting go Team USA or anything. I'm just saying that our goal of rebuilding them in a way that they'll be prosperous the same way Western Europe was successful. Now, did we let them have voice in that goal? Not much. If you're wondering what's going on back in Europe, the partitioning of Germany after World War II is changing. And as I'd mentioned, France, Great Britain, and the United States will unify their section and introduce a new German currency because, after World Wars, German currency collapses. So those 3 parts of Germany will be unified into what my generation still probably thinks of as West Germany. The Soviet Union did not want their sector to unify with the other 3, so they kept theirs separate. Within their sector was the capital city, Berlin, and then that city also was divided into 4 sectors, so you end up with East Berlin and West Berlin. And the Soviet Union got a little frustrated with a couple of things. One, they didn't like that Western Germany seemed to be more prosperous than Eastern Germany. And they were frustrated that there was a lot of emigration from East to West. So they decided that within at least Berlin, they would kind of try to show the United States and their allies who was boss in Berlin. So they cut off transportation to Berlin, which is well within East Germany, so that you couldn't get supplies in or out. So no road access, no rail access. They were fairly certain that within the United States, there was no desire to have another global conflict. They were correct about that. They were 100% correct about that. So their thought, excuse me for the yawn in the middle of that. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Their thought was, if we cut off supplies, the West will just go like, that's cool. You can have Berlin. We'll just take, West Germany. You take all of Berlin and East Germany. But no, instead, Harry Truman, the greatest president in U.S. history. Are you wondering why he's the greatest president in U.S. history? Because he's from my home state of Missouri. Okay, there you go. Okay, he's probably not the greatest president in U.S. history, but who knows? You get to decide that as well. He decides that we just can't do that. We can't let the evil, godless communists push us around, but we got to fix this in a way that doesn't literally start World War III. So they use, I think it's B-2 bombers, but they use some big planes. I'm so good at military stuff. And they drop off supplies. They put them on pallets, parachute, drop them off, because they can't land in airports, that sort of thing. So they just drop off literally tons of supplies, thousands of tons of supplies every day. And the Soviet Union goes, that's cute. They won't keep that up. They kept it up for over 11 months. Notice also, crazy, evil, godless communists, that they do this in 1948. And do you have any idea what's going on in 1948? Yes, a presidential election. And do you think that was an accident? No. Do you think they were trying to get Harry Truman, the greatest president in U.S. history, not to get elected? Yes. Because he was the greatest president in U.S. history? No, because anytime we get a new president, it leads to this kind of year where we're trying to figure stuff out and we're a little bit more unstable and we're less likely to fight with them. So pretty much any foreign power wants you to have a new leader every 4 years, because then you've got to reestablish the government. It might create some instability. And, or maybe if you have kind of a leader that's very favorable to them, they might want him reelected. Truman finished FDR's 4th term. FDR dies early. I think he dies, well, I know that he dies in April, the first year of his 4th term. So Harry Truman served more than 3 years of that term. So people saw him. He, was very decisive. Excuse me. So I think they were hoping they would put somebody in who would be a little less decisive, a little more uncertain, I suppose, about those decisions. Truman was pretty certain about his decisions, whether they were right or wrong, which again, your decision. Okay. So Berlin airlift lasts long beyond the election. Many people assessed that Truman was unlikely to win election that year. He was going against Thomas Dewey. And you've probably seen the fairly famous picture of the Truman holding the newspaper where it says, Dewey defeats Truman, because they were so certain Dewey would win that they printed the newspaper ahead of time. But a lot of political historians or political scientists would suggest that one of the major things that helped Truman in this election was how he handled the Berlin crisis. So rather than starting a war, we just dropped off thousands of tons of supplies every day for 11 months. And it was very successful. And eventually they just said, okay, we'll just open it back up. If you're wondering, did anything ever go wrong? I remember reading that occasionally like a cow would get killed or something because the pallet of supplies would drop on it. And I guess cows aren't fast or they don't look up. I don't. But as a rule, it was pretty successful. All right. After this, the United States and other nations created something called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This happens after the Soviet Union has a successful test of nuclear weapons or an atomic bomb in 1949. And the Soviet Union will form their own group later on, a few years later, 1955. And if you're wondering, like, why did they wait so long? Depends on the explanation you like. They're going to say because they really didn't want to set up an alliance system that could potentially lead to World War III, and they're trying to be peaceful and collaborative and that sort of thing. Other people would argue they already kind of unofficially had an alliance because they controlled all the member nations of the Warsaw Pact. But then the people could argue that the United States had control over member nations of NATO, which is true-ish, although they didn't directly control their government. We influence people's economies quite a bit. So Truman gets elected. So he serves one of his own terms and then 3/4 of FDR's. And that's also when we passed the amendment. I think it's 24th. I always forget if it's 24th or 25th. That limits presidential terms to 2 or 1.5. Yeah. And of course, the Republicans really sponsored that because if FDR hadn't died, he would have been president. Well, he was president until he died, but it could have been longer. He was elected 4 terms. All right. So Truman gets elected 48, takes office in 49, and in 1950 is when you have the Korean conflict. I know that I put, sorry, I'm scrolling down to peek at what's coming up. I know that I did, yeah, I want to save that part for next time. I know that I did put in the extra stuff some videos and some stuff about the Korean conflict. I think if I click on this link, I can't remember though, if I click on links, do you see them or not? I don't think you do. I probably have to share it, right? Okay. All right, I should check to see if you guys have any questions, but we'll talk about Korea briefly. Korea is often known as the Forgotten War, and I'm going to feel bad about this because we're probably not going to talk about it very much. I don't want you to forget it though. It's important. It really is kind of important for a variety of reasons. All right. So Korean War timeline, this is kind of a nice overview and shows you the 38th parallel, which is essentially the boundary between North and South Korea. There's another link that I think is in the resources that shows it's kind of interesting, I think, because it has this line kind of moves up and down depending on how far the assault has gone from each side. So what you'll notice if you look at that one, and I'll show you that link here in a minute, possibly, is that at the beginning of the war, when the United States enters, the pink part, communist part, yeah, is all the way down here by Pusan. And then by Thanksgiving of that same year, which I do realize they don't celebrate in the Koreans, it's all the way up to here. And then by Christmas of that year, which I realize may not be their favorite holiday either, it gets back to the 38th parallel. But they have a really nice timeline of all the major events. And what you will notice as well is that much of the Korean conflict really is a stalemate centered around the 38th parallel. When it's over, there's a ceasefire, but not a peace treaty. So it's officially still on, sort of, kind of. But the armistice line is really about where it was before the conflict started. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see what you folks are chatting about. Okay. Yes, if you watched MASH, that's the thing. Yeah, and it really was fast after World War II. But, we've still got all of our occupation troops in that area from Japan, and then the Soviet Union never left Korea. So this had been partitioned the same way that Germany was. The southern part unified, the northern part, the Soviet Union kept control of, and then trained troops, had added materiel, and then essentially led the assault on South Korea in an attempt to unify the country. They were going to have elections as well. And when the conflict ends, it's really as much about Stalin dying as anything else, because Stalin really pushed for this conflict and wanted to fund it in a way that was really harming the Soviet Union. They couldn't afford to do this, but nobody wanted to argue with Stalin because, well, he's Stalin, and if you argue with him, you die. Or he announces a purge against whoever you are. One of the weirdest things, I don't know why you would study Stalin separately, but if you ever do, one of the weirdest things he does a lot of weird things. I guess I shouldn't classify it that way, but right before the Germans break their non-aggression treaty, the Nazi-Soviet pact, he starts to feel like the army officers, the military officers, are going to overthrow him. So he doesn't have a good reason to think this necessarily. I mean, there's not a whole lot of evidence of it, but he just, there's some, but not a lot. So he announces a purge of all of the major army officers. Now, when he took over after Lenin's death, which he may have helped orchestrate, he announced a purge of party leaders, which, again, Khrushchev is the guy that carries out his purges. So when there's a purge, he kills everybody or imprisons them. So he announced a purge of the major military leaders and killed like 95% of his military leaders who had any sort of experience. And then right after that is when Germany breaks the non-aggression treaty and invades the Soviet Union. So he was about to have another purge when he mysteriously died in 1953. He was going to purge the medical staff at the Kremlin because he felt like they weren't operating in his best interest. So I didn't mean that as a joke or anything. But right after that, he dies. And, some people speculate that they may have played a role in that. I don't know how we would ever know stuff like that. We might. I don't know. All right. I was going to share some stuff, wasn't I? All right. Yeah. And MASH, I know a lot of people thought that MASH was about Vietnam because that's when it was aired, was during the Vietnam era. But it was definitely about Korea. Yeah, and I'm definitely from that generation too. So I know I'm older than you. You didn't have to say that. Okay, I know you didn't. You were probably thinking it. All right. Let me open that timeline thing that I was talking about. This is always my favorite resource when I taught high school about the Korean War, but I don't know why. I just thought it was fun because I'm weird. All right. I know you can't see it. Let me go back to you. Poo-poo. Huh, how did that happen? Okay, I don't want to say bad words in front of you. That's what I need to do. Sorry. It's like I have a weekend and I forget everything about technology. So one of the things I think is kind of interesting about this is that it moves over time. And it shows you like what year it's in. But I don't know why this entertains me so much, but it does. And then you'll notice that much of that conflict really does hang around the 38th parallel. But once the US troops enter in June of 1950, it's really just all that the US UN troops control really is this area around Pusan. So it's pretty desperate when the US troops enter. And then you have US troops from China, no, from Japan, oh my goodness, enter here. And then MacArthur comes in from Incheon right there, which helps them solidify all of South Korea pretty quickly. And they push up to the Yalu River and then back down. Yeah, we don't like that as much as you. I know you do like it. I know you do. All right. So let me go back to the notes and we'll wrap that up and then see if you guys have any questions. Okay. All right, back to the notes. So Korean conflict begins after the North invades the South and the South petitions the UN Security Council. So did I ever mention we created the United Nations? Oh my goodness. That'll come up a little bit later. I know we've already done it, but we'll talk a little bit more about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that sort of stuff. But the UN is created as a multinational organization that every major nation joins. And if you have a conflict, the idea is you would go to the UN and ask for assistance, and then the UN would intervene, and then they would create a multinational military force, but you appeal to the Security Council. And I think, I forget who it is they just let into the Security Council, but it was like Iraq and China, and it's like, no. But anyway, I don't know. It should just be Canada and Switzerland, maybe. I don't know. I don't know who it should be. But South Korea goes to the UN Security Council and says, help. So the United States says, heck yeah. And they vote, and it's not unanimous, of course, but NATO leads, or it's actually UN forces, are asked to remove the North Korean influence from South Korea. The goal here is to have a unification election. That's what's supposed to happen. But the UN forces are led by a lot of US military guys, including MacArthur, who won't quite make it through the war. He lives through the war, he just gets fired. But there's some talk of invading China, there's talk of using nuclear weapons, there's all kinds of talk that occurs. Our president, Truman, has no desire to start World War III, so he fires MacArthur, who he's asked to stop talking about nuking China, but he won't. Then Eisenhower gets elected in 1952. And part of the reason we elect, well, one is he's Eisenhower, but the other reason is he says, I will go to Korea and end the conflict myself. Because we'd been at a stalemate at that point for a year and a half, 2 years, and casualty rates were really high. If you go back and look at death rates, they're higher than the 10 or 15 years of conflict in Vietnam, at least military deaths. And a lot of that's because it's a stalemate. So you've got all this modern equipment in one spot, and it's very effective, for better or worse. So Eisenhower promises to end the war. Over 33,000 US deaths, over 1 million Korean deaths. The ceasefire happens in 1953 after Stalin's death. No formal peace treaty or unification. There's creation of a demilitarized zone. I think it's 15 miles wide. And of course, it's guarded on either side by North and South Koreans. So they still have conflict. There's still discussion of unification. It's still a fairly volatile region of the world, as you guys probably hear from time to time. So no formal peace treaty, no unification, and a sign that global harmony is unlikely. You're also going to promote decolonization in some areas, but not necessarily all areas. Our friend England is not quite ready. Neither is France, but it will happen pretty soon because they don't want to get rid of the colonies they control. I feel like it's about time. 15 miles. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. I'll have to double check. 15. Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop sharing. Sounds so rude, doesn't it? And see if you guys have any questions about anything. Oh, somebody's trying to get in. It seems so late. No, I know they probably got bumped out. I know that's how that works. All right, so I'm going to see if you have any questions. I'm also going to double check the roll, make sure I got everybody who's actually, oh crap, maybe I didn't get everybody. All right, did we get Tanya A? Yep, I see Tanya A. Wonder if I just marked on the wrong day here. We have Raven B. There's Raven B. I see ya. David D. Can't see a David D. And Reed D. Yep, I see Reed D. And you can type in the chat or shout out if I don't ever notice that I found you. And Amelia Duran. And next is Alex H. I'm squinting, aren't I? I don't know if that's a sign I need glasses or I'm getting old. Oh, I can stop recording, can't I? We don't need to hear this.